Hello and welcome to Stopping the World. On today's podcast, we talk to Nick Cook. Nick is an award-winning British aerospace journalist, best-selling author, former aviation editor for the Jane's Defense Weekly magazine, and a corporate storyteller with expertise in the high-tech sector, defense and security, and sustainability. Nick is four-time winner of the prestigious Royal Aeronautical Society's Aerospace Journalist of the Year award. In his best-selling book, The Hunt for Zero Point, Nick investigates the secret history and development of anti-gravity and other advanced propulsion technologies that were developed under classified government projects. I hope you enjoy this podcast and please consider subscribing to the channel. Nick Cook, welcome to Stopping the World. Thank you so much for joining. How are you doing today?
I'm doing extremely well, thanks, Ramesh. Thank you for having me.
Nick, for those who don't know, is the author of this fascinating book that I read called The Hunt for Zero Point, which you could say is like this investigative reporting almost into classified government projects that deal with alternate propulsion systems and gravity-defying systems. And during the course of this research, you of course had to travel to so many different countries, meet with so many different people, and it was almost like a spy thriller at some point. Central to this whole discussion, of course, is the whole tech-plunder. You know what the Nazis accomplished during World War II, the insane kind of technology that they were working on, and all that you came across. So maybe I'll let you begin on that subject. So how did you get involved? First of all, how did you get involved with that research? Maybe if you can just quickly give us a little bit of background, and how did it lead to this sort of unpacking what the Nazis were doing, during World War II?
So I was the aerospace editor of a defense journal called Jane's Defense Weekly, which was quite famous back in the day. I joined the magazine in 1986 and became an editor shortly thereafterwards. So my beat was aviation, and there were quite a few rumors at the time I joined the magazine that the American defense establishment had begun development, in fact, actually even was into testing of some classified aircraft programs. These, of course, were later revealed to be stealth aircraft, which it had developed in secret. So part of my beat was to look into sort of the cutting edge of military development. So I was always probing my sources for information on these sort of secret programs. So it became quite sort of inevitable after a while that I would be looking at sort of breakthrough propulsion physics, in the sense that what I was looking at, secret as it was in the form of these classified stealth programs, were very much outgrowths of kind of traditional technology. I mean, they were breakthroughs, but they were based on known physics. So I sort of posed myself a question, which was, what would a true breakthrough in this world look like? In what area would it be? And how would I investigate it? Well, I concluded that the breakthrough would be in propulsion, and that you'd have to radically come up with some new physics to lead to a sort of major propulsion breakthrough beyond the jet engine. So that was sort of my starting point. And then the next thing I knew, as I was sort of beginning to ask a few questions around all of this, I got this rather extraordinary article on my desk at work, which talked about a range of well-known American aerospace companies in the 1950s that had been studying anti-gravity, which of course was sort of where my direction of thought had been going anyway. And this was extraordinary and somewhat unbelievable to me, because, I thought I knew quite a lot about what was going on in the world of aerospace and defense, but I had never heard of these companies, which were, General Dynamics, Boeing, Lockheed, well-known company names that were studying this anti-gravity thing. So when I looked into that and I asked a few questions, I found out that part of it was real, and that they really had been studying this sort of breakthrough propulsion physics aspect of anti-gravity, and that sort of drew me in. And then, because of the access that the magazine had, I mean, it came from a very well-known publishing stable, and all I had to do really was say Jane's, and this would open doors to defense companies. It would open doors to government ministers, all of whom I could interview. My brief to myself was, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, go about your normal job, but just ask questions when you're in the right company. Well, the right company in those days was pretty select. In other words, all the freedom that I have today in discussing this topic with you, Ramesh, did not exist when I was looking at this stuff in the early to mid 1990s, which is when my investigation began. But it was only at the end of the 1990s that I'd realized I'd amassed enough material for a book. So all of it went into this book that I think we're going to talk about a bit today, which is called The Hunt for Zero Point. That was published in 2001. And so that was sort of the story of how I got started.
And I noticed at some point you said, when you were referring to these aerospace companies, you said they had been looking into anti-gravity. Does that mean it's not happening anymore, or was that an intentional that you said they had been, or do you think it's still going on, or have they achieved what they set out to do?
Well, that therein hangs the tale, because there were these articles. They were published in around the 1955, 1956 period. And they all talked about how these companies were deeply interested in investigating anti-gravity, and they were really confident that there would be a breakthrough in the next few years. And during the 1960s, it would all be under development, and then in the 70s and 80s or whenever, we'd all be flying around in our little individual anti-gravity cars like the Jetsons. Yeah. But of course, when I did a bit more digging, it was actually, I didn't even need to do any digging, because I knew, as the specialist editor I was, that breakthrough had never happened. There was no anti-gravity breakthrough in the 1960s. We aren't flying around in little, anti-gravity cars like the Jetsons. So I thought, what had happened to it all? And that again was the sort of the propulsive element, story-wise and investigation-wise, that led me on this journey.
Right. So, well, if you had to answer what happened, so we still kind of don't know. Maybe it sort of went quiet because it led nowhere, or it probably went black.
So again, those two questions were the two outcomes that really stemmed from my initial period of research. Since there were clearly no evidential anti-gravity programs in the aerospace world, otherwise I'd have heard of them. It was those two conclusions were the only obvious ones to draw, which was either it didn't work, or it did work and it had been spirited into the secret classified world, which is also known as in America as the black world, the black world of classified development. So, which of course then led me to a sort of fork in the road as I was investigating the story, because one direction led to an open world that you could investigate because it was unclassified, and that predominantly centered around a bunch of kind of laboratory tabletop experiments that NASA was doing at the time, which we can go into perhaps in a bit. But the other branch, of course, led off into the world of classified development, which is, by its very nature, incredibly hard to investigate. And I knew this already because of the investigative work that my colleagues and I had done on stealth programs. If a program is black or deeply black or secret, then you are entitled under American Defense Department law to lie about those programs if you are confronted by them. This is not a culture that we're used to dealing with in the UK, although, of course, it may be more predominant than we like to think. But these are the rules that govern a special access program or a black program. You can lie about them barefaced to anyone who comes to you, who asks questions about them, who is not cleared to know about those particular programs. So this was the challenge I faced. Also, 25, 30 years ago, when I was looking into this, there was a very different culture around this subject than there is today. It was
more taboo.
Oh, it was utterly taboo. I mean, I could not raise this topic at all in sort of what I semi-laughingly refer to as polite aerospace company. I would have been laughed out of the building if I'd started to talk about anti-gravity. And, even if I had found the right person, of course, they would be very reluctant to speak to me about it, et cetera, et cetera. So I wandered into this maze of smoke and mirrors. And that's also what the Hunt for Zero Point is about. It is about as much about the culture of secrecy as it is about the programs themselves.
Right. And I guess you could safely say that there are, for a fact that there are things that people see in the sky that they can't explain, the strange lights or crafts or whatever it is, like whose behavior they don't understand, who cannot explain. So obviously there's something going on. So either some of those black projects worked, and that's what we are seeing, or we have a true mystery on our hands. That goes into the UFO, extraterrestrial or whatever, non-human intelligence realm.
I agree with you. And I say at the end of the book, and you kindly a little earlier said that it sort of had the pace of a thriller. Well, I did that deliberately because I was writing for a mainstream audience. My mission brief from the publisher was make this accessible to people who would otherwise find this subject pretty esoteric, frankly. So I am a thriller writer. I've written thrillers previously, and I write thrillers when I get the time now. So using that technique, I was able to hopefully make it somewhat accessible. So I'm not going to give away too much for those who want to read it, because I don't want to give away the ending in a sense.
Yeah.
But towards the end, I do say this book is not intended to be a catch-all explanation for UFOs. In fact, the way I saw it, it had nothing to do with UFOs in the sense that most people understand them, which is they are, craft of unknown origin from somewhere else. Call them other planets, wherever. That wasn't my intention at all, to look at that stuff. I wanted to look at a portion of unexplained aerial sightings that I felt could be explicable by man-made classified technology. So that was my brief, and it actually represented an incredibly narrow window of the UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon subset, otherwise known as UFOs. For me, this was a very distinct subject, two distinct subjects.
Right. And how did it lead to Germany and the specific point in time, World War II, when the Nazis were experimenting with all sorts of things, technology?
So bear in mind that the magazine I came from, in fact, actually the journalistic tradition I came from, which was trade journal, it wasn't Fleet Street newspapers, sensationalism, it was just the facts reporting. I obviously was already way out of my comfort zone when I set out on this journey, because I was investigating things that were certainly pretty out there. But so it became it started to become uncomfortable to me when early on in my investigation, and bear in mind, as I said previously, that I was in places like NASA, and I had access to those places. I was in aerospace companies. I was in the Pentagon, keeping my eyes and ears open. But sooner, or somewhat soon in the investigative process, I keep bumping up against Nazi stuff, German stories, legends about the Germans having flown flying saucers in World War II. This is not where I had expected to be at that point in the investigation. As I say, I was much more comfortable being in the real world of aerospace and defense programs. So I started to look at what the mythology said around that. And there is a pretty rich mythology about German flying saucer stuff. So to begin with, I ignore it, and I put it to one side, but it keeps on coming back at me. So the breakthrough that I sort of get is in realizing that there were two very distinct aspects to German research and development during the Second World War. There was, in a way, it was a bit like the American system. There was a white world, even though it was wartime, which was sort of around the Air Force, the Luftwaffe. They sort of, did stuff, relatively openly for a wartime scenario. But then there was research that was being done by the SS.
Right. And the white world was concerned with more conventional like missiles and weaponry and weapon systems and surveillance.
Yeah,
right?
more or less, of course. And the Germans were responsible for some very advanced weaponry during the Second World War. They flew jet fighters.
Right.
They were the first air force in the world to fly operational jet fighters. They built missiles. They were highly advanced. But to go from there to they developed and flew flying saucers at the end of the Second World War, as this mythology was reporting, was a really big stretch. Huge, in fact. So, when I began to look at it to begin with, I couldn't get anywhere. But then, as I mentioned, I found out that there was this second mirror world of development in Nazi Germany, which was all around what the SS were doing. They had their own, if you like, industrial empire within a bigger industrial scene, right, in Germany. And in particular, there was an individual in charge of that top secret development in the SS at the end of the war, whose name was General Hans Kammler, who was a bureaucrat and had been tasked by Hitler with developing Germany's top secret weapon systems at the end of the war. I'd never heard of this guy, which was interesting considering I have an interest in Second World War history. And there was a reason for that, which is because Kammler had or has effectively been airbrushed from history. And he was airbrushed because there were, as I discovered in the hunt for 0 Point, multiple different references to his, quotes, death. Right. It transpired, I later found out, that he hadn't died at all, that he had, if you like, defected to give up his trade secrets for his survival, because right, this was a man who was also intimately connected with the Holocaust.
When you say he was airbrushed, who was responsible for airbrushing him out of
when I was investigating the hunt for 0 Point, that was not clear.
Okay.
What you get with Kammler, what I got then, was a trail of clues that sort of went everywhere and nowhere, in that this guy had built up an enormous industrial empire in the heart of the greater German Reich towards the end of the war. A lot of it was underground, but incredibly sophisticated. It was surrounded by an enormously sophisticated counterintelligence operation to protect it from prying eyes and spying. And so these, at the end of the war, when the sort of the Kammler trail runs out, what you get are these multiple conflicting stories about his death. You know, he shot himself. He was killed by American troops entering Prague. He, he hanged himself. I mean, there were different, 5 or 6 different accounts, which to me, of course, suggested suspicion. I mean, it was instant suspicion that these multiple varying accounts of his death had to be covering something up. But I did not know who was doing the covering up then. I do now. And at the time, it was unclear whether, for example, if he had defected, he had gone to the Americans or to the Russians, or maybe even to the Brits. But it seemed that the Russians and the Americans were sort of in there as equal sort of places where he might have gone.
Right. You said you do know now, so who's responsible? Okay,
so plot spoiler. If you want to read The Hunt for Zero Point, I am about to reveal what happened to Hans Kammler. After I finished The Hunt for Zero Point, it came out in 2001 in the UK and 2002 in the US. I sort of left it alone for a bit, and then I was contacted by a guy called Keith Chester, who was an archive digger. He went into archives looking for stuff. He had become intrigued by the Kammler story and The Hunt for Zero Point, so he said, why don't we work together? You know, you put together what you know, I'll go do the archive digging, let's see if we can find Hans Kammler. And I went, great, let's do that. So we teamed up with a couple of other guys, a chap called Dr. Colm Lowry, who knew a lot about German secret weapons and Hans Kammler as well. And eventually, we put a lot together. Keith actually found several smoking gun pieces of archival evidence in the National Archives in America, demonstrating that Kammler had handed himself over to the Americans under a deal. Incredibly hard to find. This was 15 years ago, but he found them.
Was this information not previously available to you when you wrote the book, or was it just
no.
Okay, like a recently declassified?
I mean, it was, and lots of people had been looking for him, and began to more and more in the sort of years after The Hunt for Zero Point was published, because his story, Kammler's story, was remarkably ill known before The Hunt for Zero Point came out. He had been documented in a book that I cite in The Hunt for Zero Point, which is called Blunder, and it's by a wartime journalist called Tom Agustin. And I managed to speak to Tom Agustin before he died, and Agustin had done fantastic work in tracking down Kammler as far as things went when he wrote the book, which I think was maybe around late 1970s, 1980. But Agustin couldn't find Kammler. I couldn't find Kammler in the hunt. And so that's why we went looking for him afterwards. Now, I walked away from the project that I was involved in with Keith and Colm, because I had various other things going on. They continued it, and their work is documented in a book called The Hidden Nazi. And it's a great read. It's also they partnered up with another writer called Dean Reuter, and it details exactly what happened to Kammler. And it's pretty shocking when you think about it, that this guy who knew all the Germans' technical secrets at the end of the Second World War, but who had a major hand in the Holocaust, was allowed to, quotes, get away with it. But he did. And
it's interesting you mentioned this, the mythology surrounding his death, which existed before. In some ways, it kind of mirrors Hitler's own fate, right? Because a lot of people say he shot himself or he committed suicide. Some people say he just went to South America or Antarctica. So it's interesting that there is this, we don't really know what happened. Or do you think it's pretty much well established as to what happened to Hitler? And was Hitler in the know about these secret black projects?
Well, that's a good question. Your previous question, I just put completely to one side because there's so much. Personally, I'm not an expert in World War II. I'm interested in World War II. Everything that I've ever read supports the idea that Hitler died in the bunker at the end of the Second World War, full stop. I know there are other theories around that, but that's as I understand it. And I wasn't really looking into any of that stuff. What I could do, though, with Kammler was speak with some authority because I did a lot of work on him. And his area crossed into my own, which was aerospace research and development. So I had a legitimate sort of reason for looking into his life and work. What was your second question again?
About whether Hitler was in the know.
Was Hitler in the know? So as I mentioned, there were two aspects to the German industrial development during the Second World War. There was one that was relatively open, and there was one that wasn't. The open one was managed industrially by Hitler's deputy, Albert Speer, and Hitler had oversight of all of that. It is debatable, extremely debatable, whether Hitler had oversight of what Kammler was doing, because it was so buried away, and because there is evidence, I now know, that Kammler seeing the writing on the wall towards the end of the war, I mean, like a long time before the end of the war, maybe a good 9 months, if not a year before the war ended, certainly after D-Day in June 1944, he began to see the writing on the wall that Germany was going to lose. And he began to feather his own nest to make good his escape. And he knew that his biggest bartering chip was this, his programmatic knowledge of all the weaponry under his control, which he could trade, bargain for his freedom, for his life, actually, because he would have swung otherwise. So, it's extremely debatable whether Hitler knew about all of that. And I suspect he knew about part of it because Kammler was very adept at giving just enough information to, ensure that he didn't meet a German bullet on Hitler's orders. But he was demonstrably, as I say, feathering his own nest so he could make good his escape and gain his own freedom.
Right. And just quickly jumping back to this massive infrastructure that they managed to put together, so and the secrecy surrounding it, and I think you also mentioned this point in the book. In some ways, it's like a foreshadowing or a precursor to this modern U.S. black project mythology, right? So it's like maybe they adopted that model or sort of came from there, I think.
Yeah, there's a definite foreshadowing of it, and as I was researching it, a lot of the things that, my fellow investigators and colleagues at Jane's Defense Weekly and I, we found when we were investigating things like, or looking into stealth programs and other, sort of secret American breakthrough technology, you would encounter some of the same sort of tripwires and barriers, physical or otherwise, put in place by counterintelligence around those programs. So it was all looking very familiar. And then, of course, when you understand that there was this huge race at the end of the Second World War by the Allied powers to acquire German technology, I detail some of that in The Hunt for Zero Point. You had the Russians, the Americans, even the Brits and the French closing in on what they could grab for themselves of this German high-tech stuff. And so it's really interesting to see how that race developed. And of course, the Americans and the Russians emerged with most of it for themselves. And as I say in The Hunt for Zero Point, you are able, or at least I was able, to draw this conclusion at the end of that research, that what the Americans unwittingly, I mean, no one would ever want to do this on purpose, of course, is what they unwittingly acquired when they acquired the technology was some of that same black program secrecy culture that had been set in place by the Germans. So, that's a shame, in my view. Well, more than a shame. I mean, that's an understatement. It's a tragedy in many ways because of its implications, of where it came from.
Right.
Not a good place, not good karma at all.
I still can't wrap my mind around the fact that they managed to hide it so well. Like, how did they accomplish, and not just like set up, like they seem to have advanced well into developing, so at least building all these facilities underground, no less. And you described the amount of manpower it would have taken. How did they manage to accomplish so much in sort of a relatively few years? How did they fund it? And did your research throw any light on that at all?
Well, the simple and, again, tragic answer to the first part of your question is they used slave labor. They just used slave labor straight from the concentration camps to dig out mountains, go very deep. And this was all over Germany, parts of southern Poland, Austria, the Czech Republic. This was extensive underground construction work. And even today, some of those facilities are closed off, unexplored. Who knows what is down there? But, I visited some in southern Poland, which are huge. There's a particular facility there near Rostsław, which was codenamed Riesa during the war by the Germans, means giant, and it is giant. You can still today, visit part of the tunnel complex. It's absolutely huge. How are they able to hide them? Well,
and
of course,
fund them.
Well, the reason for going underground in the first place, or ostensibly, was to protect what was going on there from Allied bombing, which was by then extensive. This was the real underground sort of construction phase of this empire went on in the last 2.5 years of the war. So going underground gave you obviously some protection. It gave you quite a lot of protection against Allied bombing. The funding aspect is more obscure. But again, funnily enough, or strangely enough, Albert Speer wrote a book after the war about the SS economic empire, which he described as this, industrial ecosystem and an economic ecosystem within the wider German Reich. There was a black secret economy around what the SS were doing, but a lot of it was based on the economics of the concentration camps, which were put to work. They built things, they developed things. So a lot of it was siphoned off from that activity.
Right. And do you think the United States sort of got the lion's share of the war spoils, do you think? Or it's sort of equally distributed amongst the Allies and Russians, or?
Well, as I say, I think the Americans, got the lion's share. There was it wasn't open at the time. It was a secret project to facilitate the immigration of German scientists into America.
Was this Operation Paperclip? Operation
Paperclip, yes. Right. And that was sort of, it became quite well known after a while. Werner von Braun, who was obviously the Germans' rocket scientist, who went on to be the inspiration for the rockets that took America to the moon. He was part of Paperclip. But there are, as the Kammler story shows, there is a mirror hidden side to that. I'm sure. I mean, there had to have been, because Kammler was a demonstration of that.
How much of modern technology that we use today, that that we come in contact with on a day-to-day sort of situation, has been derived directly or indirectly or influenced by this sort of research, the Nazi research, would you say? Because I mean, in a way, do we all have blood on our hands?
Well, yeah, you could say that. I mean, but some more than others. So a lot of those German companies that had used slave labor are still in existence today. They're around. So there's that aspect, and then of course there's the other aspect, which is, if as we've discussed, if you go in and acquire this technology, knowing that it has a very dark side to it, a dark past to it,
Right.
you do that knowingly, but in the context of the Cold War, which is what this was, because the Cold War was ramping up, as immediately after the end of the Second World War. I'm guessing that people who took those decisions, in America particularly, did so because they felt that it was necessary in the face of what they saw to be an emerging Soviet threat.
Right.
So that's why they did it.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, it's easy.
So they had
now
just
to be
cause.
It's easy to be revisionist, I think, now. We can sit back and go, okay, shocking, terrible, awful. Well, it is, but in the context of the time, it was, as I say, it was against a new world. It was in the context of a new world order, which was built up around the Cold War threat.
Right. And have you at all, I mean, the book is obviously quite old, in the sense that, have you at all been catching up on more research or more reading on the subject, or have you come across new information or something on this topic, or is it something that have you moved on to other things?
I've moved on to other things, really, Ramesh. So I've just literally started to post on Substack a serialized version of my new book, which there is a tiny amount of crossover, and it's the crossover that we were talking about at the beginning, which is UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. But it's not even about that, actually. It is about consciousness. So I took a decision that I would serialize this book, as opposed to what I've done before, which is just do hard copy books.
Right.
And it's called The Light Beyond the Mountains, and it is my meanderings into the sort of world of consciousness research. I don't know whether people know, or no reason why they should, but through a sort of rather extraordinary series of circumstances that happened to me, I ended up being the research director of something called the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies. And I know that you've interviewed Colm Kelleher, and Colm is Robert Bigelow's sort of right-hand man.
Right.
And so, it's extraordinary to me that 25 years ago I was investigating. Well, I was a nuts and bolts technology reporter, and now suddenly I've ended up researching consciousness and unidentified aerial phenomena on the periphery of that. So I'm that's what this new book is all about.
Okay, so I guess we'll get to that at some point. I just wanted to quickly come back to a few points that you raised in the Hunt for 0 Point. One is Foo Fighters. Now, of course, strange balls of light have been seen in the air way before even the World War started. And so do you know, or maybe can you perhaps hazard a guess now, looking back, were they truly German flying saucers or something more mysterious, or we just don't know?
Foo Fighters are really interesting because there are a lot of documented reports on the Allied side that Allied airmen over Germany, actually not just Germany, but also over Japan, encountered these, as you say, balls of light, these Foo Fighters, over the, in the battle spaces, the air battles above Germany and Japan at the end of the Second World War, and particularly over Germany. Some of these accounts actually detail the fact that these are sort of metallic. They're not all shining, fiery balls of light seen at night. Some of them are daytime sightings of metallic spheres seen during the day. We have reports of these same orbs flying around now, these mysterious spheres. Some of them are described as metallic, some as sort of plasma-like, and some exhibit a kind of transitional quality between metallic and plasma. In other words, people see them transitioning from one state into another, which is extraordinary. What are they? No idea. I mean, I looked in the Hunt for Zero Point for evidence that they might be German secret weapons, because this is what the Allies thought they were. They thought they were encountering some new German secret weapon, a kind of remote-controlled drone that could fly into their bomber streams and, blow them up. I dug and I dug and I dug. There was no hard physical evidence or archival evidence that was the case. So we're left then with something of a conundrum, because we literally don't know.
Right. Of course, the critical point is that none of them actually interfered with the operations of the Allied aircraft, or attacked them, or shut down their engines, or anything like that, right? We don't have any record of that. They were simply observing, or maybe monitoring, or just appearing and disappearing.
As far as we can tell, and there may be some more recent accounts that people have dug out that do talk about, interference with the engines of Allied bombers or whatever. I mean, certainly there was a report that I did come across during the research for the Hunt for Zero Point, which talks about remote interference of bomber engines, Allied aircraft engines during World War II. So American intelligence specialists were had received reports that the Germans were developing a technology that could stop aero engines in flight. They also saw reports of these Foo Fighters, these balls of light, and they sort of tried to put two and two together. That these two things were related. To the best of my knowledge, they weren't able to do that.
The other point that's of interest to me is that modern day sort of UFO flaps, or these waves of UFOs that are suddenly seen over a particular space, seem to somehow coincide with areas of distress and tumult and warfare, right? Like when there's a war, like in the Middle East, they reported seeing it between Russia and Ukraine. There's balls of light. And I don't know if you heard, even in India a few months ago, in the northeastern part of India, in a state called Manipur, where there's a lot of long-term ongoing ethnic conflict between people, and a lot of people dying. So there was this ball of light that appeared, and this is very surprising to a lot of people, because this is not the kind of subject that mainstream media in India would cover. But in this case, it was an exception. There was this ball of light which appeared over a prominent international airport, and operations had to be suspended for up to 3 hours, and there are these videos online, and nobody knows what they were. And the Air Force scrambled a jet, and then we don't know what they are. So they seem to be, and of course they're also appearing in the Himalayan region, with this heavy concentration of forces on the border with India and China, and India and Pakistan. So it's possible that they seem to be attracted towards human distress, or when there's tumult, or this heavy military activity, and nuclear warheads, for example.
Yeah, I think there is pretty compelling evidence for that today, certainly, that where you get these zones of conflict and distress, as you say, you get these sightings. To me, this is evidence of something else. This is evidence of something that is genuinely perplexing and mysterious. I mean, okay, the German stuff was too, to a degree, but we can unpick a lot of that. Right. the modern sort of frenzy over UFOs and unidentified aerial phenomena, I think is related to something else. I think there is a genuine phenomenon here that exhibits a form of intelligence that we don't understand. And I hazard that, what is happening over these areas of conflicts and distress is more to do with that than anything man-made.
So one of the reasons why I really enjoyed your book is also because for me there was a sense of deja vu, or so when I was in college, doing my undergraduate degrees, I was studying physics, chemistry, mathematics. So I remember finding this book. It's a journal, actually. I can't remember if it was Nature or New Scientist, where I read this new anti-gravity research sort of breakthrough by this obscure Russian scientist called, well, I may be butchering his name, Evgeny Podkletnov.
That's
and
as close as I can get it.
Nobody was interested in this, and I was like, am I the only one like really excited by this? And none of the professors were like encouraging me to go down that path. And I remember I took a few Xerox copies of those pages, and it's probably lying somewhere. And then this was around the time that I was interested in all these fringe things, and I remember reading Charles Billitz and William Moore's Philadelphia Experiment, where of course I came across Townsend Brown. And then so it was such a pleasure to read your book, because it's sort of seemingly fated way brought all these elements together, and I'm like, there is a link. So and I know that you did speak to Viktor Schauberger's was it son or grandson, and also
his grandson. Yeah, his grandson.
And also John Hutchison.
Yep.
So
yep.
did you? So maybe you could just
and I also spoke to Podkletnov as well. And I met Podkletnov too.
Yes, so maybe you could just quickly tell us about what was that like, how that experience like, and did you manage to see firsthand some of these devices, working?
Let's start with Schauberger. So Viktor Schauberger, for those who don't know his story, was a forester. He was an Austrian forester. He lived, he obviously, he entered my story because he was suborned by the SS, the Nazis, during the Second World War to conduct research for them into exotic energy and propulsion devices. So I went to visit his grandson, who holds an archive on his grandfather's work. To begin with, he was very reluctant to share that archive with me because he just thought I was a sensationalist investigator looking for some sensational story. Anyway, he very kindly opened up the archive and showed me some of the plans that Viktor had been working on and his diaries and things, which I detail, the results of which I detail in the Hunt for Zero Point. So Schauberger's work is interesting. Again, it's like so frustrating though, because you're so close to something tangible. I was shown a genuine machine that was called a repulsine, which Viktor had built, which kind of looked like a flying saucer, but was actually a kind of form of turbine, which was supposed to work in a rather extraordinary way. It sort of engaged weirdly a kind of fifth dimensional space through its incredibly high rotation speeds. That's at least what I was told. No evidence that it worked, though, unfortunately. I mentioned another guy in the book. He's quite well known in these circles today. He's called Dr. Hal Puthoff. Hal, I know, acquired a Schauberger machine. I think it was the only one existent in the United States. It had somehow found its way back to the US, and he tried to test it in his laboratory, couldn't get it to work. So that was Schauberger. Podkletnov was doing something different, but was linked to the Schauberger work through these very high rotation speeds. What Podkletnov was doing was building high speed was building superconductors, which he was rotating at very high speeds, and he found that when you put a weight in a column of air above the rotating superconductors, they would lose their weight. And those were the stories that you tripped over, which talked about 2.5% reductions in weight. I, like you, Ramesh, was gobsmacked by those stories. I thought, why isn't the world paying attention to this? Yeah. Well, the world wasn't paying attention, I think, because it was just extremely controversial. You probably know that NASA picked up some of Podkletnov's work and they tried to replicate it and they couldn't replicate it.
Right.
And Podkletnov said that was because they did not have the secret source for his ceramic superconductors. That's why. Right. I struggle with the whole Podkletnov story because he's never produced any evidence of his claims, which is that you get these weight reductions in the weight of objects above the superconductors, and then he developed a secondary version, he said, which was produced a repulsive force, so that you injected a current into the gravitational beam, and you had a weapon,
Right.
So, prove it. Well, he never did, to the best of my knowledge.
And also the reported weight loss by percentage is kind of minuscule to be of any commercial significance, right? It wasn't much.
It was, but of course in laboratory bench test terms, 2.5% is enormous. It's huge. It may not have had a commercial application then, but hey, if you start at 2.5% in a laboratory, then you hand it over to some applied scientists and engineers, they can do stuff with that. But again, it never happened, to the best of my knowledge.
Right, and then we come, of course, quickly to Townsend Brown, which is probably one of my favorite characters in the story. And did you find out anything more interesting about him? Because he seems to have been almost like this forgotten genius who's a contemporary of Einstein and who's done a lot of Einstein kind of stayed mainstream and his work seems to have gone underground, either because they were not really of worth, or maybe he found something so useful and secretive that it went underground.
I was talking to another podcaster yesterday about Townsend Brown, and I had to hold my hand up and say I was slightly embarrassed that of all of the people who come into the Hunt for Zero Point, he was probably the one I felt I knew least. And the reason for that is I did a lot of digging in archives and things about Townsend Brown. Plus, there's an awful lot out there on him anyway. Right. He's associated with crazy stories like the Philadelphia experiment about a disappearing warship. And yet he is a real character. You can see he has obviously real historical footprint. But the one thing I didn't do, which I did with a lot of my other sources and characters who appear in the book, is talk to people connected to him, relatives or people who knew him. So I always felt I'd slightly shortchanged Thomas Townsend Brown. But I agree with you. I think he's a really fascinating character. He did work for the Navy, US Navy, in the late 1940s, I think early 1950s. He was associated with some really interesting sort of physical work and experiments. But again, like all of these other characters, his sort of work peters out. The trail sort of disappears. And these poor guys, they end up in sort of obscurity or semi-obscurity. Right. So, that's what I feel about Townsend Brown. But, to a degree, his legacy lives on because the electrostatic anti-gravitational force, if you can call it that he discovered, the Townsend, the Biefeld-Brown effect,
right,
which produces a sort of levitation.
Right.
I've seen that demonstrated in little models called lifters, which they work, but how they work is another question.
Right. Yeah, I was actually going to jump to that question next, whether you've heard of the Lifter project, because as soon as I found out about Townsend Brown, during those times I was Googling, and I came across this website, this French man called Jean-Louis Naudin, who has extensive videos and instructions on how to construct your own lifters using the old CRT cathode ray tubes, like drawing electricity from those, because you need voltages which are in the range of like 10 to 50 kilovolts or something. And it was really fascinating. I tried to get in touch with Jean-Louis on his email, and I couldn't reach out just to see where it's at now. But all of them were like really small level, like they were like just really small models, and not obviously they were all tethered to a source of electricity power, so they couldn't really go anywhere.
Correct. Well, anyone who's interested in seeing a lifter in demonstration, I made a documentary in 2005, I think it came out, on the History Channel, 2-hour doc, about the relationship between sort of UFOs and it's a relationship actually between UFOs and disinformation activity. So it's how sort of that side of things covered up, disinformation covers up secret stuff. But at the end of the film, I go and see a guy in Seattle called Tim Ventura, and Tim had built lifters, and he demonstrates one to me in his garage, and it flies, and you can see I'm there, Tim's there, and then this lifter is doing its thing in the garage. But you're right, it's that they're of very little practical value at the present time because their lifting force is so minimal,
Right.
But nevertheless, it's an interesting concept. And of course, the controversy surrounds the fact that, is this an anti-gravitational force? Well, probably not, because actually
ionic wind.
It's this thing called ionic wind,
right,
which is the movement of electrons over the surface of the lifter, which is pushing it forward or up.
Right. And of course, the character John Hutchison, who had these crazy effects.
I really enjoyed going to see him. John is based in Vancouver in Canada, and I'd been referred to him in that. For those who know the Hunt for Zero Point, I end up towards the end of the book at a Lockheed Martin facility in Fort Worth. And I interviewed there a senior scientist, Lockheed Martin senior scientist called Boyd Bushman. And Boyd spoke eloquently about the mysteries of the universe in a way that I had never heard before. This was sort of particularly from an aerospace guy. But at the end of the interview, Boyd I think the cameras had stopped rolling, and Boyd pulled me aside. No, maybe they hadn't. I can't remember. Anyway, he pulled me aside and said, "You should go and see this guy called John Hutchison, because I think he's the real deal." And I'd never heard of John. But John had already been funded by the Pentagon to the degree that this guy, John, he was levitating objects, household objects, weird stuff, with all kinds of strange devices that he'd got from thrift stores and old warships and God knows what. And he'd put them into his home, and then he'd flick the switches, and then these things would levitate. Unfortunately, he did things like blew the circuits on the neighbor's televisions and stuff like that. So he wasn't that popular in the neighborhood. But John was great. I went to see him. He verified everything. And then I went to speak to the guy at the Pentagon who'd funded his experiments, who was a chap called Colonel John Alexander, who's quite well known in sort of UFO circles as well. And John verified all of that. He said, "Yeah, we did fund it. Actually, sadly, we couldn't get his stuff to work in the way that we'd hoped." He said it was almost as if, it's John's mind which is doing this, causing this stuff weird stuff to happen. He said, but most of his team, not all of them, came away thinking there's something real here.
So if John was the critical element there, almost like a conduit for these forces, what did something happen when you spent time with him asking these questions? Obviously, the equipment was there, I think, in his room, in his apartment.
No,
Was he
it
able to
didn't.
demonstrate?
It didn't at all. I mean, not that I was aware of. No, no, didn't happen.
Okay. So it seems to me like a lot of these sort of breakthroughs have happened, maybe with the exception of Podkletnov. Most of these have happened, like if you take Viktor Schauberger, John Hutchison, they're not like, they did their things with just spare parts from the garage or in a small. So it's almost as if they found some principle of nature that nobody else has, and it's this kind of possibility is accessible to anyone who cares to just tinker with it. In, in terms of money, it's not so demanding. It's just, you could just, like, somebody could just do it themselves in a garage, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are several aspects to that question, I think, which is, one is that there is a particular breed of, sort of scientist and engineer that is, relentlessly curious, and will just go away into their garage or garden shed or basement or wherever, and they'll just tinker with stuff, until they get it to work. And they are inspired to do so by some idea they've had. And maybe their brains work differently, they're slightly wired in a different way. I get that. I mean, totally. But then there's another sort of rather heretical aspect to all of that, I think, too, which is that, and I think this is what John Alexander was hinting at to me, which is, if you don't believe this stuff is going to work, particularly if it's the source of its strangeness, its power, if you like, comes from somewhere else, if there's a sort of fifth dimensional force, a sort of esoteric aspect to it. But if you don't believe that's going to work from the get-go, then it isn't. But if you're somebody like John Hutchison, who believes that it is, then it will work. And
Right.
that's, I think, that is what John Alexander meant, which is, without that, I think he was also alluding to the fact that he felt that there was a sort of psychic quality to John Hutchison, which was helping to facilitate all of this stuff. But if you don't have that, I think there's, in some circumstances where people have come up with something really genuinely interesting, it's going to inhibit the result or the
Right.
intended result.
It's almost as if, it's kind of ironical. It's almost as if skepticism and a sort of a scientific inquiry, the very nature of it, sort of blocks these energies in a way. If you sort of tend to believe
I
that,
agree.
right?
I mean, I think there's no hard evidence for that. And of course, this is why science doesn't like any of this stuff, because a lot of it is unrepeatable.
Yeah.
The benchmark of success for science is, repeatability in a laboratory, proving a theory. But this stuff doesn't seem to conform to that rule. So
Right.
it is, or has been, dismissed extensively by mainstream science.
Another phenomenon that comes to my mind is the metal bending by Uri Geller, because there's been, I'm sure you're familiar with Uri Geller's work, and there's been like plenty of accounts and oh wow.
That is a Uri Geller spoon.
So you had a first-hand experience of it happened in your
twice. I went twice to see Uri in his house, and actually that did come about from the Hunt for Zero Point, because Uri read the Hunt for Zero Point, and I got a call one day. At least my wife got the call, and she said it's Uri Geller on the phone, and he was currently, I think, or just been in a popular TV show here called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, which
Right.
puts celebrities in the jungle. And Uri was on. So my kids had followed this, and they were really sort of, they knew everything about the show. And so when my wife said that Uri Geller is on the phone for you, my initial reaction was that it was somebody playing a prank.
Right.
So I literally said, "Get out of here." And then I realized it was Uri Geller. And so after apologizing, he said, "Would you like to come to my house? I'd like to talk to you about the research you did for the Hunt for Zero Point." So I said, "Great." So I went along. We talked about the hunt, and then he did a demonstration of the spoon, which, lo and behold, bent before my eyes. But I said to him afterwards, I said, God, it's such a shame that my family isn't here, because they would love to have seen this. So he said, bring them next time you're passing, bring the family. Oh, and bring your own spoons. So I thought, okay, well, now I've got a chance to sort of do my own, sort of rather poor quality desktop experiment with URI. So I brought my mother-in-law's spoons, which were made of really stiff Sheffield steel. I brought 2 of them along, and in the next time that happened, so my son and daughter were there, my wife was there, and a friend of my son, and my son and his friend were both 10. So this friend of my son's, chap called John, he held both spoons so that they were nested inside each other. Right. And while he held the spoons, URI passed John's other finger over the spoon, and both spoons bent. I can't remember if this was one of them, but anyway, it bent like that. And then when he put them down on the desk, they continued to bend. Wow. And that one for me was particularly mysterious and effective, because I know because I was watching, URI never touched those spoons at all. And secondly, they were my spoons, or at least they had been under my control. So Go figure. Now, people say that he's, a trickster. He might be. There's definitely a showman element in URI. Yeah. But I've heard plenty of people in the sort of parapsychology world, some of them in the military intelligence world, going, he's the real deal. Wow. So I choose to believe he's the real deal, partly because of my own experience, but also because I know people well who have tested URI under having been under CIA and Defense Department auspices. So, and they were baffled by some of the stuff he did too.
Did you get that on your second visit? Did you get any of that on video at all?
No, I didn't. I mean, it's annoying. I wasn't even thinking about it in those terms. It was crazy. I just turned up with spoons, and the family. Right. So I should have, yeah.
Right. I mean, at least you have this signed spoon.
At least I got a signed spoon. I had 2 signed spoons, but unfortunately, we had a cleaner many years ago who came in and thought that the URI's signature, which I'm told is actually worth quite something on eBay, not that I'm going to sell this, she thought that it was dirt on the spoon, so she cleaned it off with bleach. So sadly, I don't have the second spoon anymore.
Wow. And of course, speaking of CIA engaging these people with psychic powers, of course, I think you also met some remote viewers.
Yeah. I did. So the hunt for 0 Point has been an extraordinary sort of calling card for me. So the URI call was a sort of, an intriguing one out of the blue, but I also got a call from a chap called Ingo Swann. Right. And Ingo Swann was a remote viewer, so he was otherwise known as a psychic spy. And Ingo worked with Dr. Hal Puthoff, whom I've already mentioned, who was a laser scientist initially, physicist, working out of Stanford Research Institute in California, who had this idea that you could psychically spy on, well, in those days, the Soviet Union. So this program was set up, I think, in 1972, and Ingo was the original remote viewer who worked with Hal and Russell Targ on that program. Right.
And of course there were more after, and I remember reading Ingo Swann's book Penetration and remote viewing on the moon and so many things, and there's this I don't know how authentic this is. There is a CRV, or a controlled remote viewing manual, supposedly designed by the CIA, which gives step-by-step instructions on how anybody, apparently it's a learnable skill, and they had a lot of people come in and try at the Monroe Institute. By the way, I also tried contacting Joe McMoneagle, who is supposed to be another extremely successful remote viewer, but I never heard back from them. And which brings me quickly towards the end to UFOs. Of course, UFOs have been around way longer than the secret projects or the black projects or the Nazi projects. And people research UFOs and talk about them as if they were they are just nuts and bolts technology. And they're like, you could expect like disclosure to be a craft landing in front of the White House lawn or in New Delhi or in the Parliament building, and then aliens announcing themselves. But then I have increasingly been of the view, which I'm sure you've also spoken about and you agree, that it's something wholly related to consciousness. And you've mentioned this as well, and this is where I want to get your view. So what do you think of UFOs? And I know it's also there in your next book.
So, to begin with, I think, I'm particularly coming from a nuts and bolts tradition myself, at least in reporting terms, the link between consciousness and UFOs is not intuitive. I mean, it's not clear. People always say, well, what's the link?
Right.
So, and it's quite interesting because I faced this myself when I was sort of plotting out this new book, The Light Beyond the Mountains, which I'm now serializing on Substack. But I lay out actually the link somewhat in the introduction to the book, which was posted about 4 weeks ago. So the link, I think, to put it very simply, is that we do not understand what reality is. I mean, we think we do. We think materialist, reductionist science has a handle on that. You know, the physics of matter is well understood, and, you know, stuff is stuff, and the world that I see outside the window in front of me is very separate from me, and, you know, this is the objective reality as it is handed down to us by physics, you know, mainstream physics.
Yeah.
But actually, if you do a little research around how we derive our picture of reality, and, you know, beyond the known physics of, you know, light entering our eyes and, you know, all of that good stuff, or sound waves entering our ears, there is a great deal behind this perceptual interface that is just not seen, not known, not computed by us. And there is a fantastic guy who called Professor Donald Hoffman, who has come up with a theory of reality, which he calls conscious realism. But it's analogous for him to how we derive, we get our information from the graphical user interface of my laptop here, on which there are icons. I click on the icons. I do not need to go diving into the squirrely software of my machine. It's all presented for me through these icons. And he says that's very much, in his view, how reality is. We as humans have derived an interface which gives us all the reality we need and no more for our survival. And we generate a picture of reality through clicking on an infinite variety of icons, which is any kind of interactive experience that we ever might have.
And I believe you had your own UFO experience?
Well, I have. I've literally, I've just written it and just posted it today about that experience and why it forms the opening piece of this new book. And I had it 30 years ago. I was camping on the periphery of Area 51 in Nevada, seeing what I could see in terms of classified aircraft under test. And I saw this ball of orange light came up at night from the hills surrounding the base, so right above the base, and then floated off downrange. I was with a colleague from another magazine, a chap called Guy Norris, who's now at very famous American aerospace and defense journal called Aviation Week. And we both saw it, and, you know, there it was. And I put it to one side for many, many years. I just didn't even think about it. But then when the New York Times wrote its rather seminal story about this top secret unit in the Pentagon that had been secretly studying UFOs for some time, and that article was posted in 2017, that sort of rekindled my interest. And I thought, well, I wonder what I did see in 1992. And anyway, by then I was kind of on a consciousness path. Various things had happened, which again I detail in this new book.
Right.
And it's sort of, anyway, that is the sort of the inception point of this new journey.
And are you a spiritual person at all? And do you think there's a connection to spirituality and this sort of openness to hold this sort of and accept and allow this sort of wider view of the world also helps you to actually see them, where a skeptic may not?
Well, it does. I am a spiritual person now. I don't think I was particularly spiritual. I mean, I had beliefs, but I wouldn't call them particularly spiritual when I started investigating the hunt for Zero Point. Do I think it helps me see things? I mean, do you mean see as in understand things? I think
also,
it gives
does it appear only to believers, so to speak?
Oh, no. I mean, I've heard plenty of accounts from people who see things who have no belief, zero belief whatsoever. In fact, I had a personal experience of that a couple of years ago. We were on holiday in Portugal with a bunch of friends, and one of these friends was particularly, well, not even agnostic on the subject of UFOs. He probably was quite, against the whole idea of them. Well, we happened to be sitting outside at a table eating, and I had my back to the sky. I was facing the house, and he was with a bunch of people looking out, and he kind of went white as a sheet because he said, "What was that?" And by the time I turned around, whatever it was had gone. But he described a spherical ball of light that had shot past behind me and the other people on that side of the table. And it has led him to seriously question, what it might have been, because it was nothing he could square with any belief system that he had. And he was I think he's less skeptical now, but right. He was a total and utter skeptic about these things.
And why do you think the US government, especially, or people are now coming out and publicly, accepting that there's something going on? Because I remember reading, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Carol Rosen, who used to be a spokesperson for Dr. Wernher von Braun. And there is a story, and I don't know how true it is today. I remember reading that apparently on his deathbed, Dr. Wernher von Braun told her that, there will be attempts to sort of bring humanity under one control. There'll be the bogey of terrorism, and, 26, I mean, the WTC attacks happened, and of course there are a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding that. And then apparently he mentioned that the final bogey would be sort of an attack from space, and there'll be like an orchestrated, like an aliens attacking humanity to bring everybody together under one world government. Now, I don't know how true that story is, but then do you think this sudden change of heart and promotion of these craft coming from somewhere else through some official or officially sanctioned channels like David Grush, is there something more to it, or is it just people coming out?
Well, on the Wernher von Braun part, I probably, I think I mentioned before, that is so it is so far from the way I think.
Okay.
That I'm not saying it's not true. I just don't even go there, because if I can't verify it, I don't look at it particularly. Okay. I mean, I'll read it, but for it then to be absorbed by me, I need to have sort of ticked it off and checked it and verified it. And so I haven't done that with that story. On the broader topic of what's going on and why is there more engagement by the US government on this issue, the UAP issue. Well, I think simply its hand is being forced. I think it's doing it reluctantly. And it all flowed and stemmed from that 2017 New York Times story that I mentioned, which that's when things got really interesting in this modern era, because the New York Times outs this secret unit in the Pentagon, which had been run by Lou Elizondo, and then Lou Elizondo with Chris Mellon, who had been a former defense undersecretary in the intelligence arena. He and Lou sort of worked this kind of disclosure program through, of all people, Tom DeLonge, who's a rock star. But more and more pressure was brought to bear on the government to say something, particularly when you had videos coming out showing that these objects were being encountered by pilots. The military pilots were standing up and saying, we don't know what's going on. So somebody had to say something. It couldn't just be buried and ignored anymore.
Right.
And so I think that, it's been done under duress, but there is a certain school of thought that says the phenomenon is doing the dictating, is dictating the pace. There seem to be, I've not done this scientifically, but there seem to be many more sightings now than there were in the sort of the recent past that I can recall. And maybe that's just because everyone's got camera phones and we're all aware of it now. But something seems to be happening. I mean, there's so much activity on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., trying to force the Pentagon and the intelligence community there to divulge what it knows. There are whistleblowers coming forward, as you've mentioned. So stuff is happening, and
Right.
It doesn't seem to be going away.
And of course, like even if you look back periodically, this thing has come up, and there have been like inquiry committees, and like Project Blue Book, and the investigation happening, and then finally it just comes to nothing. So do you think this is just another such phase in a long line of spike in interest, or what do you feel? What's your gut feeling? This time it's like there's a real push this time, regardless of where it goes eventually.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, there have been waves and initiatives before that have just gone nowhere. Obviously, I didn't live through those, and if I did, I was totally unaware of the subject matter then, so I didn't pay it any attention. So I do think, though, that this current phase is different. I think there seems to be some real energy behind it. And I think it is linked to, as people have said, secrecy in government. It's not just about, unidentified flying objects. It's about, what do you, as a government, keep secret? What do you shield from democratic institutions? What do you shield from the public? And I think it's as much, to do with that as it is about wanting to know the truth about, extraterrestrials or non-human intelligence. I mean, I think that's what it's sort of bound up with as well.
Right. Would you say that you're in a way on the inside, so to speak, like compared to the common man, as in you've had like contacts with the defense industry in the past, with with the probably classified stuff and stealth stuff? So would you say that if someone were to find something out or hear some rumors, you would be able to do that if you had to research, look into this?
As you just said, I mean, I have a background in defense journalism, which gave me good contacts in that field. And I think if I have a USP at all, it is that I come from that discipline, which was loosely described it as a nuts and bolts discipline, but
Right.
I was a technology journalist looking into aerospace and defense programs. So I have that background in my blood, if you like. But then what I've done is come from completely the other direction. I sort of, I bootstrap myself up into the consciousness field through a relentless study program, which I sort of began in 2019, which I again refer to in the introduction to this new book on Substack, which has given me a completely different perspective on the UFO phenomenon, which is this consciousness one, and looking at it through the lens of sort of, of reality physics, if you like.
Right. Right.
So I'd say that's sort of, I think, where I fit into this space. I'm not an investigative journalist anymore. I don't do that. I talk to people. I've got good contacts. I like to think I know how to do a bit of analysis. So it's those sorts of things that I think I bring to the party now.
Right. And as the absolute last point before we conclude, I wanted to touch upon the cultural aspect of UFOs. Now, of course, these strange lights are seen all over the world, but one common question that I get when I talk to people and friends here is, seems to be happening, why do aliens only go to the United States? Why is this such a US or a Western phenomenon? Now, my usual answer is two words: reporting deficit. Like, people just don't report these kind of things. It's not in the cultural habit or practice. I mean, people don't even, like, especially in India, people don't even look up at the sky. Like, how often do people observe the sky for things they can't explain? They're all looking down into their phones. So if you discount that, when you talk about these close encounters, these are almost always technological, or maybe now recently more spiritual. But in a culture, like, say, in an Eastern culture, which has a completely different worldview, they would be taken as gods and deities, and it wouldn't even make the news because it's not even a thing. It's not even, it's like accepted that there are beings. It's a bigger world is part of the everyday life here. So have you ever pondered over this cultural difference when it comes to close UFO experience?
Yeah, I have. I'm not sure what conclusions I've reached. I mean, obviously, you're right. America seems to be where a lot of these reports come from. And again, I think you're right that is largely down to a reporting culture. And I mean, even to the degree that, for a long time, as we know, these sorts of stories were fodder for, pulp papers like the National Enquirer and stuff. But at least through those channels, the subject was sort of maintained in the American public consciousness. But in other countries, it may be less so. But I don't think those countries are devoid of sightings, as you say.
Right.
They are. It's simply that, and you're right again, there is not so much of a culture in those countries to interface with the phenomenon, culturally or in any other way. So they almost literally remain unseen, and they certainly remain, or a lot of them remain, unreported.
Well, on that note, I think we have to wrap up today's call, and I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's almost an hour and a half, and thanks so much for coming on the channel.
Thank you so much for having me, Ramesh. It's been an absolute pleasure.